Hello students, and welcome to my first recording for topic 3. So in this topic we're going to continue to expand our understanding of issues around the strategic analysis, the first part of the task that we've been asked to do. And so in this topic we're going to talk about things like the actual process of a merger itself or an acquisition, and how that fits into the kind of strategic direction of the company. Now, for some of you, this may be new material, but I think for many of you, you might have covered some of these issues before. Right, so in the first part, in this first recording, I'm going to talk to you about what's the difference between a merger and a takeover or an acquisition. Right, so a merger is typically agreed upon by the boards of both companies. Right, so your company approaches another company and says, look, we're interested in a merger. And you negotiate with the board of that target company and come up with terms that are agreeable, right? And the two companies will join together, right? So an example I've got here is the merger of BHP Billiton to create BHP and Billiton to create BHP Billiton in 2001. So we had a British mining company and an Australian mining company, and they merged together to create a single entity on roughly even ground, on a roughly even basis, right? So in the case of a merger then, the key thing is that the two organizations, the two companies are joining together to create, in effect, a new combined entity or a third entity, if you like. An acquisition, on the other hand, is typically a combination of unequal companies. That is a larger one acquiring a smaller one, although it isn't always the case that it's a larger acquiring a smaller, but clearly a smaller company acquiring a larger one is often very impractical. Right? The amount of funding it would require would make that extremely difficult. Right? But it's typically a larger company acquiring the smaller company, in which case often the name of the original entity stays, right? Because it's become an acquirer, it's not a merger. Now, acquisitions can either be a friendly takeover, again, where the board agrees. Right? Now, again, so that's going to be process-wise very similar to the merger, with the exception being that it isn't really a merger or a creation of equals. Right? And so why does that matter? It matters around things like the board. So in the case of a merger, you often have the combined board of the new company as roughly equal numbers of board members from the two companies that made it up. Whereas in the case of an acquisition, it will still be dominated by the original board, right? There might be very few members of the target company who get seats on the board. Or a hostile takeover, right? Now, a hostile takeover occurs where you try to buy the company without, with the opposing, or the target company, I should say, management resisting you. All right, so the board of the target company says, no, we don't want to be taken over, and actively tries to resist you. So an example then of an acquisition would be something like Wesfarmers' acquisition of Coles in 2007, right, where Coles just became part of Wesfarmers, right, rather than a kind of mergers of equal. Now note, in this case, this was not the acquisition of a public company. Coles itself was spun out as part of the Coles-Myer Group. All right, so that's the main difference. Now, in terms of what we're going to be talking about in your assignment, then you've got to think, well, what does this actually mean for me? What are we doing here? Is it going to be a merger, or is it likely to be a takeover? Now, why does it matter whether it's friendly or hostile? Right, I've just mentioned there, at least in the case of a takeover, a merger obviously is always going to be friendly, but in the case of a takeover, right, it can be a hostile takeover. So why does it matter? Why does it matter how that process unfolds? Well, the most simple answer to that is cost and time. All right, if the target company board agrees to the takeover, then you are much more likely to succeed. It's more likely going to occur more quickly. It's probably going to be a lot less expensive. You'll have better access to information, right? Because you'll have access to the company's financial information, which you may not be able to get as a hostile, or it may be more difficult to get hold of as a hostile bidder, right? And so the cost and time is the key issue here. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the costs of takeovers in one of the other recordings in this topic. right? The other thing when we talk about cost and time and likelihood of success, we also need to put that in the context of the different types of transaction, right? So if you engage in a takeover of another firm, then you can do so by two main mechanisms in Australia. The first one is what's called a scheme of arrangement. Right, this is a legally binding transaction or a legal arrangement between the two companies that ultimately results in the transfer of control. Now, in order for that scheme to be approved, then a resolution in favour must be passed at meetings of each class of target shareholders by both 75% of the votes cast on that resolution and 50% of the number of target shareholders. So you need 75% of shareholding, the number of shares, to vote in favour of it, and you need 50% of the number of shareholders to vote in favour of the resolution. Right? Now that's quite a large hurdle to meet. And it's very, very difficult to meet that hurdle if it is a hostile takeover. Right? It's not impossible, but it's very difficult to meet that hurdle. All right, so this tends to be used more in the case of friendly takeovers, where it's more realistic that you'll get 75% of the votes cast, right, and 50% of shareholders likely to agree. Now, the key thing then under a scheme of arrangement is that success generates 100% ownership. Right? This is what makes it quite attractive. You either get 100% ownership of the company or you get nothing at all. So it's an all or nothing. You don't end up with just a half of the company or some proportion of the company, which leaves you nowhere really to go. Right? So it becomes very attractive for that reason. The second one is an off-market bid. And in the case of an off-market bid, then what you are doing is trying to buy the shares directly from the target company shareholders. Now, again, if you do an off-market bid, if you want to compulsorily acquire 100% of the company, then you must own at least 90% of the target shares. All right. Now, it's also important to note that you can only own up to 20% of the company before you're required to make an announcement about whether you are attempting to take over or not. And then in order to get that compulsory acquisition, 90% of shareholders will need to sell to you. Right? And so if you want 100% of the company, then you need 90% of shareholders to sell to you. Now, you can imagine that if the target company is opposing you, that can be very difficult to achieve. Right? Now, all of these have implications. The more difficult it is to achieve, the higher the price we might have to pay in order to ensure success. And we have to then weigh that up against what are the potential benefits associated with it. Now, if on the other hand, you're only seeking control rather than 100% ownership, right, then you need to have only 50% of shareholders, of the shareholders, or of the shares, I should say, of the company, right, in order to be able to constitute being getting control of the business without necessarily having complete ownership of the business. Okay, so what we have discussed here then, right, are the different ways in which you can take over and why you might prefer, or at least the types of schemes or the types of mechanisms you would engage in a takeover. And one of the things that we also need to consider then is that when it comes to a takeover, if it does become hostile, right, if the target company's management refuses to accept that takeover, then they have many, many different types of strategies that they can use to defend themselves. Now, I've chosen some of them here, but this is not an extensive list, or exhaustive list, I should say. I have given you a link in the Canva site to a much longer list of takeover defenses, together with some of the explanations of them. Right, so some of the things that you can do, you can start repurchasing shares yourself. Right, you can engage in what's called a poison pill, where you put in place derivatives that allow, or options that allow the shareholders to buy more shares in the event of a takeover. Right, and in fact, making it just much more difficult and much more dilutive for the acquirer. You can create a staggered board where only typically a third of the board members get elected each year, making it very difficult for them to get control of the company by virtue of getting control of the board. Right, because remember, one of the other ways you can actually effectively control a company is by taking over board seats. Right. Golden parachutes, where you put in place very large payouts for senior management in the event of a takeover. Green mail, where you actually agree to buy back the shares at a significant premium from the acquirer, and then often that's accompanied by a standstill agreement where they agree not to buy any more shares. Right. Leverage recapitalization, so change your capital structure, right, which can often involves putting on more debt, making it more difficult and piling on the acquirer a great deal more debt. Leverage buyout, where you actually start trying to buy out the firm yourself, right? Where senior management will actually try and buy out the firm. You can sell off the crown jewels, right? You can actually sell off the part of the company that is the most valuable thing, the thing that they'd actually want, meaning that what they get if they do succeed is the parts of the business they don't really want anyway. You can do a Pac-Man, right? And you may recall Pac-Man's that computer game where you go around chomping and you eventually can go back and chomp the ghost. Well, the same thing happens here. Is in the case of Pac-Man, you can actually acquire the company you're trying to acquire you, right? You try and acquire them instead. A white knight, in the case of a white knight, you find a third-party company to acquire you that you would prefer to be bought by, right? So they will come in and buy the firm instead. Right? And again, this often relates to a management team that management is perhaps more willing to work with, or will put in place agreements that will ensure that board members can retain their board seats and so forth. And another one is a white squire. So in the case of a white squire, what happens is that you are having somebody come in as a third party that you would prefer, but instead of buying out the entire company, they just buy a large enough shareholding to block the takeover. Right. So again, I mean, if you're going for something like a scheme of arrangement where they were looking for 100% control, then they need to buy 10% of 90% of the shares. So if your white squire were just to acquire 11% of the company, then that would effectively block that takeover. Okay. And so what we've got here is a list of things that companies can use to try and make that takeover more difficult if they don't want to be acquired. And all of these things either result in the takeover being unsuccessful or at least significantly more expensive than was originally planned. Okay. And so when you're looking at the companies in our particular case, so Aristocrat and Woolworths, right, you have to think about, is this a viable strategy in terms of its strategic direction? But you also have to think about, well, what's likely to be Aristocrat Leisure's board's attitude towards this? What's that going to mean in terms of if they put in place defenses? Will that make it more difficult? Is it worth it? All right, if they are likely to be resistant to this type of offer, and ultimately, what's it going to cost? All right, so these are some of the issues that we're going to think about to get us going thinking about this dimension of the particular case study. In the next video, I'm going to talk to you about the different types of takeovers and acquisitions. And so you can think about, well, which of those applies in this situation and how does that affect what we're analyzing here as to whether this is a worthwhile transaction or not. All right, so I will. Hello students, and welcome to the second recording for topic 3. So in this recording, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the different types of mergers and acquisitions that a firm might engage in. And as I do so, I want you to think about, how does this relate to the example that you've been given? Okay, and so when we think about the main types of mergers and acquisitions, we can classify them according to 5 main categories. Right? And so mergers and acquisitions can be classified as either horizontal, vertical, conglomerate, congeneric, and market extension. All right, so what constitutes these different types? What distinguishes one from another one? Okay, so firstly, horizontal then. In the case of a horizontal merger, what happens is you have both firms are in the same industry. Right, so you have a firm operating in the banking industry that acquires another firm operating in the banking industry. Right, now this type of acquisition or merger is often done in industries where there is a lot of competition, because it's seen as a very efficient way to increase your market share, because the net result of any sort of horizontal acquisition is an increase in market share. Right, and that is simply because the combined entity is now going to control the market share that was held by 2 separate firms originally. Okay, so both the acquiring firm and the target firm are in the same industry. Now, I want you to keep this in mind when we get onto the next recording, where I'm going to talk to you a lot about some of the advantages and costs associated with these different types with the mergers and acquisitions in general. Right, so I want you to think about, well, if they're in the same industry, what does that mean in terms of the potential benefits? Right, now, typically, you're going to see a lot of firms or a lot of mergers and acquisitions will take place in the same industry, right? Because it makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Right, to start with, the management of the acquiring firm, right, or I should say, or in the case of a merged firm, both management teams already have experience in running a business in this type of industry. Right, so you're acquiring another firm or merging with another firm that is very similar in terms of the operating style, the industry it operates in, the structure, the competition it faces, the customers it deals with, and all the other challenges that go along with running a business. Those challenges in the company that you're acquiring are very similar to what you're already dealing with as a management, right, as a management team. And as a consequence then, not surprisingly, there are significant benefits associated with acquiring firms in the same industry, not least of which, as I said a minute ago, is an increase in market share. Right? But there are other benefits as well that we will talk about in the next recording. Okay, so this is the first one. Right? Now, as I said, key characteristic that defines this is that both firms are in the same industry. The second type of mergers and acquisition transaction that we might look at is what's called a vertical merger or vertical acquisition. And in this case, what you are doing is acquiring a target firm that is either up or down the supply chain from the acquirer themselves. Now, the supply chain is the process by which you go from raw materials and through to the production of a final product or final service, whatever it may be, right? And so it's all the way from materials, manufacturing, distribution, etc., retailing, and so forth. So in the case of a vertical transaction, then what you are doing is, if you're starting, let's say here in manufacturing, I'll keep it simple and put one in the middle, then you're either acquiring a firm that's a supplier to you, right? So you're acquiring control over your raw materials, right, or your semi-manufactured goods or whatever it may be that is the input into production for yourself. Or you might be acquiring a firm that is further down the distribution chain, or further down the supply chain, I should say, like a distribution outlet. Okay. Now, in doing so then, what you are doing is attempting to increase your control and your reliability over that supply chain. Right? So it's often about securing supplies or securing markets or securing distribution outlets, right? As seen as a primary motivator behind this type of transaction. The third one is a conglomerate merger. And in the case of a conglomerate merger or acquisition, you are acquiring a firm that is in unrelated industry, right? That has very little to nothing in common with how your firm already operates. Right? So industry A, firm A, or the acquiring firm is buying a firm in a completely different industry, industry B. Now, in this case then, some of the advantages that you might see in, for example, a horizontal merger don't exist. There is no commonality, there's no benefit in terms of the acquisition through that process. But there is an argument that's often put forward around this that says that one of the reasons why we might want to do this is because it diversifies our business. Right? So it's kind of following the same principle as diversifying investments, you just diversify the business itself. Now I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about that, as I said, in the next recording and some of the issues around that. Right? But that's essentially what happens with a conglomerate merger, is that you are acquiring businesses in unrelated industries. The next one is a congeneric merger or acquisition. In this case, this occurs where between firms that operate in the same market or sector with some sort of overlapping factors. Right? That is, they have common technology, they have common marketing, they have common production processes or research and development, something like that. They're in different industries, but there is some common element. There's some overlap between how the acquiring firm operates and how the target firm operates. Okay, and so in other words, there is some element here that when combined together, right, you can take advantage of the fact that there is that combination between the two. Right? This will give rise to what we call synergy, right? Which again, I will talk to you a little bit more about in the next recording, right? When I talk about pros and cons of the different types. But as I said, in this instance, what we're focused on is the fact that there is something in common that will provide us with some benefit when merged together into a single entity. And finally, the last one is market extension. Right? Now this occurs where firms that, or between firms that do sell the same product, they have the same product or service, but they just compete in different markets. Now, I've given you an example here that's perhaps the most obvious one, and that is that they are in different geographic locations, right? So you have an Australian firm that acquires a firm in the United States that's doing the same thing. So an Australian bank acquires a US bank, for example, right? So there is commonality in terms of their products that can then be marketed in the other market. They just can't currently competing in the same market, right? So in essence, as it says here, this is an extension of your market into an overseas market. Right? And remember, again, that one of the reasons why you would engage in a merger or an acquisition rather than simply start the business yourself is that buying an existing firm gives you a head start. Right? It gives you some market share. It gives you an established firm with both supply and distribution outlets. Right? So rather than having to build those things up yourself, right, this is seen as an advantage to acquiring a firm or merging with a firm, as opposed to simply, I'm going to expand my business into that new market. All right, so what we've talked about here then in this short video is just the different types of mergers and acquisition transactions. And I've given you some diagrams here to help you kind of visualize what these different types are. Okay, so keep that in mind. I will see you in the next recording. Hello students, and welcome to my third recording on mergers and acquisitions. So in this recording, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the benefits that are meant to accrue out of a merger or an acquisition with another firm, and also what some of the potential costs or drawbacks might be of engaging in that process. Okay, so why would a firm engage in mergers and acquisitions activity? Right, so there are a number of reasons why this might happen. And this is not necessarily meant to be a comprehensive list. I've just drawn out what I think are some of the main reasons that we see in this area. Right, and of which the most important one that's often mentioned is synergy. That is that the firms combined together will create value for their shareholders. Others include things like risk management, increasing market share, and income smoothing. All right, so what do we mean by synergy and how does it arise? Right, so as I said, the concept of synergy is that you combine two entities together to create something that is more valuable than what the separate firms were. Right, so it's the classic example of 1 + 1 = 3. You combine these two things together, you get something more than what they were worth as individual entities. Right, and this is often brought about by economies of scale. Right, that as the firm gets larger, then we can cut down on some aspects or gain benefit as the result of the scale of the firm. And I've got a diagram here that's a nice summary of where the value of synergies come from the Deal Room website. And you can see in here that there's a number of important things that might drive synergies. Right, you're not necessarily going to get all of these, but you need to have something in here in order to create that value. Right, and so it may mean things like revenue. Okay, so by becoming a larger entity or by acquiring another firm, it may be able to either increase volume or increase pricing. Now note that the increased pricing is potentially going to be the result of moving towards more monopolistic competition, right? As your firm gets larger and larger, you begin to be able to dominate that marketplace. And as a consequence, then you are no longer a price taker and you become a price maker. Right? And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that a little bit later in the lecture, because obviously this is both an advantage in the sense that we can increase revenue by virtue of the fact that we can charge whatever price we like, right, or move in that direction, but it also creates drawbacks, right, and potential risks for the firm. The second one is cost. All right, so we can create synergies by reducing costs. Right? And we saw that when we talked about in the last recording, when we talk about things like the congeneric merger, right, where you've got some aspect of the business that's in common. So, for example, research and development, you can get both a benefit out of that, but you can also potentially reduce costs. Okay, by instead of having 2 R&D departments, you only have 1. Right? And in fact, most firms have some aspects of this they might be able to do. Again, you don't need 2 accounting departments, you only need 1. So that means you can get rid of 1. When the combined entity is put together, you maybe don't need 2 marketing departments, you only need 1. Right? So even though you've got 2 lots of revenue combined together, you can reduce some of those costs. And in doing so, of course, create value. Okay, so ideally you might be able to do both revenue and cost, but even if you only get one of those, that's going to be sufficient to generate some economies of scale. The important question, as we'll talk about in this recording, is how much economies of scale, and is it enough to justify the costs? The third aspect is capital. Right, you can actually create economies of scale through benefits in terms of your capital, so reducing fixed assets or improving working capital across the firms. Now, note that if you're talking about certain types of mergers, like a conglomerate merger, for example, many of these synergies are not likely to occur. It's going to be difficult to get revenue synergies when the firms are in unrelated industries. It's going to be difficult to get cost-related synergies, again, if the firms are in unrelated industries. You might, however, get capital synergies. Right? It might be possible to get capital synergies through that process. And again, other financial, reduced taxes, increased debt capacity. Right? All firms, by virtue of getting larger, may potentially benefit from increased debt capacity, right? Particularly if it involves the acquisition of more assets that can be used as collateral for increased debt capacity. Okay, so synergy is one of the driving rationales behind the idea of engaging in a merger or an acquisition, right? Particularly when they are horizontal mergers, I should say. Right? It's one of the driving aspects behind horizontal mergers, because the idea here is, as a management team, we already have experience in running this type of business. So as we acquire more, we can spread that experience out and take advantage of what that means in terms of increased revenue and reduced costs. Okay, so as I said, this is one of the driving aspects of one of the most important reasons behind a merger or an acquisition, right, or one of the rationales. The second aspect or rationale behind a merger and acquisition is the idea of reducing risk, as risk management. All right, and here what we're saying is essentially that we want to engage in this activity as a tool, not so much of creating value, but rather of reducing risk. Right? And some of the risk factors that might apply are things like supply reliability and distribution reliability. So if you think about the vertical merger that we talked about in the last one, if I move back into supply or down into distribution, then what I am doing is not so much attempting to create value, but rather trying to create certainty about the supply of my raw materials or the inputs of my production, or certainty about my distribution. Right? And you can imagine that, as we've seen in the last couple of years, as the result of the pandemic, right, there is a significant amount of demand for companies to be able to, or concern for companies to be able to control their supply chains, because those have been severely disrupted. Right? An event like the COVID pandemic has severely disrupted company supply chains. Right? So if I were to buy the companies that supply, or at least one of the companies that is my major supplier, then at least I guarantee that I will be able to get the goods or services from that supplier. Likewise, if I move into distribution, I buy a shipping company, then at least I can guarantee I can get my product to the market without having there being no shipping containers available or no ability to be able to do that. Now, of course, this has to be weighed up against the costs associated with doing it. But essentially, the driving rationale behind those types of mergers is to create some or reduce the amount of risk associated with that supply chain. Another aspect that comes under the area of risk management is the idea of R&D uncertainty. If I am a company that relies heavily on research and development, let's say a pharmaceutical company or a technology company, right, then I invest a lot of money into research and development, and there is always going to be the risk that it doesn't succeed. Right? I'm going to work on this new cure for COVID-19. We spend billions of dollars on it, and ultimately it doesn't work. Right? All that money is potentially down the drain. Now, as a consequence then, there is significant risk associated with things like research and development. And what some companies will do instead then is, rather than take that risk themselves, they will outsource it. I will sit back, I will allow other smaller entrant companies or new businesses to actually engage in research and development, and if they succeed, I'll just buy that company. Right? In essence then, you are shifting the risk from yourself to all of the other small businesses who are prepared to take on that risk, and then just acquiring the technology or the research and development once it's proven that it is successful. Right? And so again, this is a tool of engaging in takeovers for the purposes of reducing your risk. And finally, the last one is new entrants, right? And in a sense, this kind of relates to that idea of R&D, but it's not necessarily R&D. And that is that you might have new businesses and that are entering the market. They may be dynamic, they may be different enough with products. And as opposed to your firm, where you may have gotten into a position where adapting to current market conditions is proving difficult. The firm is large, there's a lot of inertia, and as a consequence then, it is often a case that we might just say, okay, we'll acquire these new businesses that have these new ideas or these new products, rather than trying to do it ourselves. So basically, they bring the new product or the new idea, we bring the capital, because we're large enough and established to be able to do that. And again, this is another way in which a firm can adapt by doing it through external growth, right, rather than through internal growth, through actually adapting and changing the way the firm does business. Instead, acquiring businesses that have those new markets or the exciting new products that consumers want to acquire. Now, note there is again a risk associated with doing that, because one of the things that we sometimes find is that when a large, well-established company takes over this, innovative new business, they try to convert that innovative new business into their established model for operating, and they lose the very thing they were trying to acquire. Right, the dynamic, the innovation, the ability to get in contact with its customers or to maintain relations with their customers and so on. A lot of that may disappear as it gets absorbed into this larger, well-established business. All right, but again, this is the kind of rationale behind doing so. The third one is market share. Now, market share can also feed into things like synergies, as I mentioned before. So the idea that you can increase revenue by virtue of becoming a price maker rather than price taker. But also think about market share as a way of actually increasing or acquiring other businesses as a way of simply increasing your market share, rather than trying to attempt to entice customers away from a competition. All right? And this is really is particularly appealing in very highly competitive industries. So where you have an industry where it's not dominated by one large firm, but rather there are a number of different firms and the industry is well established, then in that case, those types of firms often have a lot of trouble expanding their market share against their competitors. Right? So one of the examples we can think of is the banking industry in Australia. Here we have, in particular, the big four major banks, all of which are well established in the market, and so it becomes very difficult for them to acquire market share from each other. Right? We see this when, for example, one of the banks might offer us $5,000 if we swap our home loan to that bank. So again, they're trying to increase their market share in the home loan market. But it isn't long before the other three banks will also offer us $5,000 or $6,000 to swap to them. Right? In other words, a lot of those strategies become very difficult to apply once you have a well-established competitive market. Right? It becomes difficult to expand through enticing customers away. So what you can do instead is simply acquire another firm and get its customers that way. Right? Expand and acquire the other business. Now, there are situations, though, where that might be restricted. For example, as I've said here, whilst the banking industry is a really good example of a highly competitive market, it is also one where they can't merge or combine together. They can't acquire each other. And the reason for that is that Australia has a 4 pillars policy that says the big four banks must not merge with one another. Right? They must remain separate entities. And so no matter how attractive it may be for them to simply acquire the other banks, right, for the largest to start acquiring the other ones, as a way of increasing their market share, they can't do it. Right? What that means, of course, in practice is that in Australia it's very dangerous to be bank number 5, because if you're bank number 5, you can be taken over. And that is one of the ways in which the big four banks do try to increase their market share, by simply acquiring the 5th biggest bank. Right? And that's what happened when we saw Westpac take over St. George at the time. Right? Or merge with St. George. That's because St. George at that time was the 5th biggest bank. Okay, so again, the rationale here is that we need to try and increase our market share. How do we do it? We can't do it, or we're struggling to do it, by just acquiring market share through normal competitive activity. So we instead do it via acquisitions. And the last one I wanted to talk to you about is the idea of income smoothing. All right, so here I've got a kind of diagram that just shows the income stream for two businesses over time, firm A and firm B. So firm A, you can see income fluctuates around in a very seasonal fashion. Likewise, firm B fluctuates around in a very seasonal fashion. Now, these two ones are very much shown to have a very high negative correlation in this diagram. And you can note, of course, and if you combine these two together, then you will end up with a firm that has a much flatter trajectory as far as revenue is concerned. Right? It won't have that seasonal distribution that the individual firms A and B have. It'll be much more stable and much more reliable. Right? And so what this means then is things like its earnings per share numbers will stay steady. And there is a view that managers think that shareholders will care a lot about that earnings per share number, and therefore are concerned to actually do things that will smooth it out, rather than having highly seasonal fluctuation. And so as a consequence then, you're not going to get this type of relationship in firms that are in the same industry, because if they're in the same industry, they tend to all fluctuate together. So this is often seen as a kind of rationale for conglomerate mergers and acquisitions. Right? By acquiring firms in quite different industries, we can smooth out our income or our revenue and offset the effect of seasonalities within parts of our business. Okay. What we need to ask, though, and what we will be asking in a second, is that actually a good rationale? Okay, so in this case then, one of the things that we also need to then consider is some of the costs and concerns around M&A. So we've talked about the benefits, right? Why we do it, what's the rationale, what do we get out of it? But we also want to consider the costs and concerns that might arise.
right? Now, the most important one is the takeover premium. Right? If we talk about costs, we're talking about the takeover premium. There are other costs as well. We will need to hire lawyers, we need to hire bankers, we need to hire accountants, etc. There will be lots of other costs incurred, advertising, printing, postage, etc. But the most significant one will be the takeover premium itself. Right? So we need to think about who benefits, and is it better for the shareholders to diversify themselves, particularly around conglomerate ones. I also want to think about things like management focus and the impact of things like market power and competition. Okay, so firstly, if you want to try and persuade shareholders to sell their shares or vote in favor of a scheme of arrangement, the types of takeovers that we talked about in the first video for this topic, you're going to need to persuade them to do that. And typically the only way you're likely to do that is by offering them more than what the shares are currently worth. Right? So again, imagine that I want to take over firm B, their current share price is $1 per share. If I offer them $1 per share, the current market price, it's very unlikely that I'm going to get 90% of them to sell their shares to me, right? Which is what I would need to meet that requirement we talked about in the previous recording. However, if I offer them $1.50 a share, then there is a good chance that I will be able to get enough of them to sell their shares to ensure that the takeover is successful. So how much does it cost in terms of a premium? How much more than the current share price do you need to pay in order to persuade shareholders to sell? Now, the studies on takeover premiums vary across jurisdiction and time, but most suggest it's at least 25%, and it tends to be higher for hostile takeovers, perhaps lower for friendly takeovers. All right. A recent study by RSM of 605 deals in Australia between 2005 and 2020 found the average takeover premium was 34.7%. Right, that's a significant amount that you have to pay to acquire that target firm, right, or to merge with that target firm. Now, this value then accrues to the target firm shareholders. They're being able to sell their shares or get the value of their shares at significantly higher than what they're currently worth. On average, 34.7% according to that data. There are also some studies that find that the acquiring firm shareholders actually lose value. And one of the things we often see is that the acquiring company's share price will fall on the day of an announcement of a takeover. And that is because there is concern that a value is being shifted from the acquirer to the target. Right? That it's the target shareholders who get all the benefit, and the acquiring shareholders are actually losing money in that process. Now, this is by no means a certainty, and there are studies that do say that the acquirers will also value. It's just perhaps over a longer time, and it's more difficult to recognize. All right? But the key point I wanted to make here then is that what we're doing then is we're essentially weighing up those benefits that we just talked about against things like this cost. Right? So are the synergies enough to justify the cost? If I get 10% synergies and I have to pay an extra 35% to acquire the firm, is it worthwhile doing that acquisition? Right? Or do we ultimately end up worse off? And one of the really important issues that comes up when we start talking about the takeover premium is, what does this mean for conglomerate mergers, right? Or mergers that are based where synergies is not the driving force, right? Where things like risk and other factors, income smoothing, are important. Right? There's an important argument that says that in the case of a conglomerate merger, rather than company A acquire company B to smooth out the earnings, instead, the shareholders should buy shares in A and shares in B and create a portfolio that does the same thing. And it won't cost them 35% takeover premium to do that, right? So in other words, why should the company pay a premium to diversify when the shareholders can do that themselves without that cost? Right? And this is one of the really important questions around whether a conglomerate merger is actually in the best interest of the shareholders. The next aspect is management focus. All right, so the idea of engaging in mergers and acquisitions is a very time-consuming process for management, and it might be their primary focus during a period of many months. So during that time, who's running the company? What's happening? What new innovations? What ways is the company developing? What new products, etc.? Who's overseeing all of that? Right. So in other words, if I required a manager to manage a company on a professional basis and they are busy doing something else, and they're not managing during that time, right? So it has to be that takeover or acquisition must be worth it. It needs to be worth the time and effort that management are putting into it, in addition to the cost. Right? And then, of course, this raises the question, well, what happens if the takeover fails? What happens if the management team has spent months and months of their time working on a takeover and ultimately doesn't succeed? Now, this then plays into the takeover premium. If I know that this is a risk, then perhaps we should offer a little bit more in order to make sure it succeeds. And of course, again, now you're increasing now you've got one risk factor increasing another one, increasing the cost. Okay. And finally, market power and competition. Okay, so how are those synergies created? Are they the result of a move towards monopolistic competition? In other words, does the firm move from being a price taker in a competitive industry to a price maker? Right? And I know that many of you will have studied things like Porter's five forces models and so forth, and will have a good understanding of how industries work. And this will also play into your the components of your strategic analysis report. Right? So you will also draw upon your understanding of markets, market competition, how markets operate, and all the things that you will have studied in your previous buzz units should also feed into that analysis report. How will the competition authority react if it does create that kind of monopolistic competition? Right? Will the ACCC, the competition authority in Australia, immediately say no? No, this breaches competition law, or will be in contravention to competition law, and therefore we will block this takeover, right? And therefore it won't succeed at all. Right? All of these factors play into whether a particular transaction is worthwhile or not, right? Or should be undertaken or not. And like I said, these factors will need to be addressed in your report, right? The relevant ones will need to be addressed in your report, and you'll need to provide evidence to support those assertions. All right, so that completes our recordings on the mergers and acquisitions aspect. What we'll be talking about in the next topic, and of course you're going to be exploring this in greater detail in the workshops, right? But what we're going to be talking in the next material on Canvas is professional report writing. We're going to talk a little bit about how we write a professional report and ensure that what you submit when it comes to that strategic analysis and final report is the best that you can actually do. All right, so I will see you in the next recorded material.